Did you know that the French could check their bank accounts, purchase train tickets, and even stream video online almost a decade before dial-up made it to American households? How about the fact that today 86% of French households have access to fiber optic internet compared to a mere 50% in the United States? And that while Americans pay an average of $85 per month for gigabit speed internet, the French enjoy up to 5 gigabits for just €29 per month. And do they pay for all of this with their data? Unlike the United States, European residents enjoy a relatively high degree of data protection and privacy provided by the GDPR, the European Convention on Human Rights, and national legislation. And when it comes to AI, Europe is moving on that too. Stay tuned for all that and more coming up on the Royal Palace podcast.
I've ordered every federal agency to eliminate rules that don't make sense.
It's the usual French talk, stall and surrender.
All scientists dying on purpose. The cultural hold the narrative.
You Americans have given us such sense was very evil.
Make our planet great again.
Now, what was interesting about the sort of evolution of Minitel compared to the internet we know and love today is that it had been an in-house project, meaning it was run by the PTT, which was the essentially ministry that was in charge of telegrams, telephones, and postal services. And that made the French internet, the Teletel or the Minitel, very state-run and state-managed. So they were in charge of the infrastructure, but also the service providing aspect of running a system like this. You had much more government involvement than you did with DARPANET, because DARPANET was very quickly spun off into the private sector, whereas Minitel was, again, very much led by the French government up until the 90s, where they started to spin everything off into a more of a private model, as unfortunately the post office is, after over 100 years of it being a properly publicly managed entity, became a private company.
Yeah.
But it's at arm's length. So they operate like a private company, despite having certain public service obligations, which the government pays them for. This is kind of actually an interesting thing, which is that a lot of Europe has managed to privatize postal services.
Much more so than the US, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think of England.
In England, it's completely privatized.
And it's still called the Royal Post, right?
Royal Mail.
Royal Mail.
That's the English, like British difference is we call it the post office, they call it the mail. But what comes to your door, we call the mail and they call the post. It got flipped at some point in the US.
Yeah, and it's kind of wild because it's like the United States has privatized everything, like virtually everything.
Yeah.
The whole state has been privatized, but not the post office. I have no good explanation for why, but it's a good thing. Let's keep it going.
Yeah, yes.
So my goal with bringing this up is just to say, okay, the internet, yes, the internet that we know today is a U.S. invention, but the U.S. was not alone in the development of these technologies. And in fact, France, but Europe generally, had a major role to play.
Yeah.
It's just they simply didn't win, right?
Wasn't the World Wide Web itself was invented at CERN, right? Tim Berners-Lee and all that. I don't really know the history very well, but...
So as we said, moving into the 90s, we changed the way in which telecom providers operate in Europe, moving to a more private model, even though a lot of state-backed providers remained, but just in a private form. Now, you compare this with what was happening in the US when DARPANET was spun off into different cable providers or different internet service providers. They sort of divided up the country based on geographical regions. I mean, the whole, antitrust history there is very interesting, but we're not going to get into it. But it was a completely different model of development because you had providers in the United States responsible for not only service providing, like that, providing the plans, the modems, and any other equipment or to the door wiring that was required, but they also were in charge of the infrastructure itself. And that is a little bit different than the way most countries in Europe went, because most countries in Europe, they had a public entity that built out the infrastructure and that would either remain holding that infrastructure or force competition amongst providers. So in France, France Telecom, which again is eventually called Orange, owns a lot of the backbone infrastructure that connects France. But because the government essentially pays them to do it through a contract, they are required to allow other operators to have access to it, which leads to this weird situation in France where you have many telecom providers, but they're all pretty much using Orange's network leased by law, right? They couldn't not do it to those providers. What this means, and the European competitive framework that, because the European Union has done several directives on telecommunications in order to facilitate the way they operate in the union. What this means is that there is a pseudo competition that exists in Europe, where, for example, you will find that you have the choice of 4 different operators for a cable or a fiber connection in your home, despite the fact that obviously they don't all 4 run their cables to your home, right? There's not 4 parallel cables. What this means is, one, you get much more competitive pricing for
Yes.
internet service providers.
And for telecom in general, just for phone plans, it's way cheaper here than in the US.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll give you an example. You could get a gigabit fiber connection in most of France for about 20 euros a month with a 1-year contract. If you really like data, as I do myself, you can get a 10 gigabit fiber connection for 30 a month. So I pay 30 a month for what people in the US could only dream of. Most Americans, if they're lucky, have access to 100 megabits per second internet. So that's a tenth of what most fiber connections in France are in terms of speeds. And you get it at an extremely affordable price. I mean, I know people in the US pay $80 to $150 for really subpar internet coverage through cable, right? Again, we're not even talking fiber, which has a massive deployment in France. I mean, the government has pushed fiber deployment across the country to the point where, outside of kind of more rural areas, you will have fiber. Honestly, Liam, if you wanted a connection like the one I have in the United States, you could only probably get that through enterprise fiber. Like, only companies can get access to what I have, even if you had the money, realistically.
Yeah, it's definitely, that's a huge thing that people notice. I'm just, hearing what people back in the US pay for just their phone plans is obscene. I mean, didn't we figure out at one point, Patrick, that it would be cheaper, like if we were to move to the US? Like, I remember you spent like a couple months in the US a couple years ago, and you discovered it was cheaper to buy a prepaid SIM card from Free, which is a low-cost French phone company that had I don't know what it was, like less than 10 years a month. It included like tons of gigabits of roaming data in the US.
That's
And
right.
that was it makes no sense. Why is that? Why would that be so much cheaper? Because they're paying someone in the US for that roaming data, right?
Right. Well, they don't see those as competitors, right? They don't think it's a viable option for people to fly to France and sign up for French telecom. But yeah, no, exactly. When I go to the United States, I have free roaming in the US up to 35 gigabytes a month. And my monthly phone bill is 15 a month in Europe. Right. And thanks to the European Union, you can freely roam within the European Union. It's pretty much transparent.
Oh, yeah.
It used to be you
really
go to
great.
Germany and it would be really expensive, but now you can just kind of go everywhere in the Union.
That's a good example of the EU actually doing something that's pretty good for Europeans. Which I wouldn't say that about many of the things they do, but that's just fantastic. Like, you can go anywhere in Europe if you have a EU cell phone plan, and for the most part, it acts as if you were back in your home country where you got that plan in. Just no restrictions whatsoever. Although I do know that some companies have found ways to implement some sorts of restrictions.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's probably not supposed to happen, but sometimes they might deprioritize your traffic.
Yes, definitely. And they contract you with the worst phone companies, the worst systems in those countries.
So actually, I'm not entirely sure about this, but I think you can freely roam. So one
Yes,
thing,
you can. So back when I had free mobile in France, which is again the low cost option, so they always, when you went to another European country, they would put you on the worst network possible, something you've never even heard of, with some ridiculous name, like all these startup phone companies. It was called like Bluebee or something,
right, that
and it
owns no
only has,
infrastructure.
yeah, exactly. And so it's terrible. But yeah, you can go into your settings and force it to give you a different one.
Yeah, exactly. Like basically they're through their APN, they're going to automatically give you the worst provider if they can, the cheapest for them if they can. But yeah, you can go in your phone settings under network configuration and basically force it to take a better operator.
Yeah, they also, as I found, they do get upset if you use uh, like your phone plan more outside of the country you got it in than the one you got it in. So that thing about doing that, going to the like getting a French phone plan, using it in the US wouldn't be viable long term, as I found when I moved to Spain and kept my French number out of laziness for like over a year, I think. And also, like, there's no reason not to, you know what I mean? It was like it works fine for everything, um, except for some government services sometimes. But they kept sending me increasingly angry texts about how I was clearly not living in France and exclusively using roaming. But
Yeah,
I
so
got away with it
there
for a while.
is like the European law does allow for companies to restrict you. I believe it's just 3 or 6 months, something like that.
I think
Like
it
if you,
was that I think they said that you can't be spending more than 6 months outside of like France on
but
the or
the
using this plan in another country.
but what's really cool about how coding works is it's always a form of abstraction, and you're relying on engineers, humans, to determine how these things are calculated, right? And so I'm not entirely sure, but I suspect that many of these operators basically just set kind of like limits from last connection from France. So like I think my guess, I don't know, but my guess is with free, as long as you show up in France once a year, it'll probably work.
Yeah, I was also in these things where they just kept emailing me about it and texting me and being like, "We're gonna cut you off this time," and then without doing it. So you know what I mean? It's like how an old bank account I've been unable to close has been sending me emails for like 4 or 5 months now saying accept our new terms and services now or we'll close your account. And I'm saying great. I tried to get them to close my account like last year and I couldn't do it for some reason because I don't live at the address that I lived at when I made the account. But they've been telling me, this is your last chance to accept the new terms and conditions for months now.
And there's some other interesting aspects also about this legal framework. For one, normally there's some exceptions, but normally contracts above 1 year are not allowed. Right? It's very common in the U.S. to get locked into a 3-4 year contract if your provider can push it on you. In France, I mean, and this is very annoying, by the way, but in France you'll get a 1 year contract for like say 19 a month. At the end of that term, they make it 30 a month, which forces you to move providers once a year. And a lot of people just stick by because they don't want to bother moving. So that's kind of how they get you, but at least you're allowed to move. Whereas I'm sure you've had this experience in the US. I mean, it's like, you get a plan for $50 a month with like 5 gigs of data. I mean, this is a long time ago, but you get something like that. And then 2 years in, or maybe a year and a half in, you realize that a competing provider offers half the cost for the same amount of gigs, or the same price, but they double the gigs or whatever. To the point of absurdity where T-Mobile often, I remember because I took advantage of this unfortunately once, offers to pay your cancellation fees with your other provider, which were like $300 to cancel your plan or whatever in the US. Also, just what an insane circle of just like money circulating where providers are paying each other to like get you out of a contract. Like if everyone's offering that, it's almost like, I mean, to the consumer, it's like there's still a contract and it's a pain for them. But between themselves, kind of net zeros, I think. I don't know. It's a weird system you got in the US. And then in the US, you also have regional providers. Like you have some networks that basically only work in California, which is wild.
Yeah, this is clearly an example of how European their sort of much stronger antitrust stance than the U.S. Really benefits consumers.
So antitrust definitely plays a role in some of this, but most of this is actually telecom regulations in Europe.
Right, sorry. And antitrust is the wrong word. It's
No,
you're
it's
right.
not
And they're
it's not the
not,
wrong word, because there is an antitrust logic in all these regulations.
but they're not as interventionist antitrust as the US used to be, for example, back in the days of splitting up Bell Telecom and so on. The EU has not really shown themselves to be able or willing to take on those kind of big fights, even though they do sort of, say things to send Silicon Valley into a panic every once in a while. Like that they would split up Google or something like that. But they've never actually done anything like that. But um, yeah, these sort of regulations like that really do benefit consumers.
Yeah, and I would say above all, make sure that they have what they believe is a perfect market, right? Like they're
Yes,
very much
that is their obsession.
Yeah, because their whole thing is they look at the United States and say, whoa, you don't have a perfect market, because if you can only choose Comcast, then that's not really competition. And so they adopt a much more like market focused approach. The problem, though, is when you go so far down the regulatory road, you kind of have to ask yourself, wait a minute, why isn't this just all public? Right? Because why is why are there like 15 different like small providers that are just renting from someone else? Like, where are they making money? They aren't,
Yeah,
right?
and you get some things that are so regulated in Europe that it's like pseudo public. For example, gas networks in a lot of countries, energy, these sort of things where like the prices are uniform, they're regulated, the contracts are long term, and actually the companies have very little leeway in what they can offer, which is for good reason. However, it's what is the point of this charade? Um,
Well, do you remember that when energy prices, because of Ukraine speculation, went through the roof, like at the beginning of the war?
yes, yes.
Well, what was great is, a lot of people didn't pay those increased prices because their contracts or because they were still on the kind of regulated tariff that no longer exists.
Right, those were spot market prices that we were seeing.
But a lot of energy companies, like most of the like energy companies that essentially just do a form of market arbitrage, like they don't actually make any of their own energy, went out of business during that time, and everyone just found themselves back on EDF, which stands for Electricity of France, which used to be a public entity, was privatized, and apparently is now being brought in.
Yeah, it's one of these what I'd call like semi-public companies that you have a lot of in France, where a significant percentage of it is still owned by the French state. And you have this with a lot of like these major French companies. When they were privatized, they were only like partially privatized. Yes, the state took 100% of capital in 2022. Anyway, I think it's fair to call EDF one of the world's largest electricity companies to be as semi-public.
Yeah, even though, again, as Liam mentioned, it's 100% in the state's hands now, and they called it renationalization, right? Because the market was nationalized for the first time in 1946 and was essentially just managed by EDF up until it was privatized in the 70s. I believe it was the 70s. And in the framework of this renationalization, though, it's still a company, right? It's not been essentially rolled into a ministry.
I don't know how that really changed from what it was before, because before it was a private company that was majority owned by the state. But of course, this makes a big difference for a lot of things, right? Like the state is, nominating the board because they're the majority owner, now the whole owner, but it's not a public service. It can't make a loss, right? And it sort of has to act like a private company under European competition rules.
There's a certain advantage in owning state companies. Like, I have nothing against it. But the problem in running it like this is you bring in a completely corporate logic into the daily operations, where they'll make decisions on the basis that, well, something's not profitable, even if it's the right or good or proper thing to do, right?
Because they kind of have to, right? Like according to their corporate charter. But why, right? If the state's the whole owner, why do it like that?
Well,
It
because
doesn't
the
make a lot of
state makes
sense.
money off of it. It's
Yes.
as they call it in France, the état actionnaire, the state stockholder, and they seek profits. That
But the classic logic of the attacks now is not mainly for the state to seek profits. It's mainly for the state to be able to have a say in what happens to large companies within the state, right? Like have a be able to have an active industrial policy. Yeah, I mean they don't completely. There are still political decisions being made in the running of these companies. That's the whole idea. But it is still not running it like a public service does have the effect that the state owning this doesn't really benefit the consumers, aka the French people, that much. But that's especially all the more so because, again, within these markets like energy, they're legally required to act competitively.
What's really crazy is EDF is the main producer of electricity in France. They control a large portion, if not all, of France's nuclear installations, which generate a lot of electricity to the grid. They're forced to sell those kilowatt hours to companies that then resell it to you and I, or to commercial consumers or industrial consumers. But the EDF is forced to sell it at a advantageous rate to them, like at a lower than normal rate, because they have too dominant of a position in the eyes of the European Commission.
The European Commission's ideology is very interesting. Yeah, it's this, like you said before, it's this obsession with a pure market, and with pure competitiveness. I mean, it's kind of a certain school of mainstream economics wet dream. Well, a certain school, right? Because there's a big school of mainstream economics which says that the state shouldn't be doing anything. But you also get sort of a big part of mainstream economics that really says that you need a strong regulator to enforce competition. And the European Commission sort of takes this way beyond anything we see in the US, to a sort of bizarre extreme in some cases, especially because they're a supranational body, right? So this has been discussed a lot recently in the context of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, the Biden administration's, pouring of money into the economy, and especially all these subsidies for green energy and electric cars and stuff like this. The European Commission very upset about this. They really don't like that because they see that as an anti-competitive practice, and they stop anyone from doing that here in Europe, basically. Like the kind of things that the American government did, the French government wouldn't be able to do, the German government wouldn't be able to do, because it contravenes European rules about subsidies. European rules about subsidies are very strict.
Yeah, in principle, the rule is you cannot subsidize.
Yes, or you can subsidize. It's just that you can't pick winners, so to speak. Like if you subsidize something, you have to subsidize that entire market. That's my understanding, right? So you can't be like, we want to promote and develop electric car manufacturing in our country. Here's an electric car manufacturer. Let's try to promote them and develop them. It's like, no, you have to make it available to everyone within that sector uniformly, because otherwise it would be unfair competition. And that's especially a logic that you see.
So it's actually more severe than that. Article 107 on the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union holds that, save for otherwise provided or as otherwise provided in the treaties, any aid granted by a member state or through state resources in any form whatsoever which distorts or threatens to distort competition by favoring certain undertakings or the production of certain goods shall, insofar as it affects trades between member states, be incompatible with the internal market. Now, there's exceptions. There's a few of them. First of all,
agriculture.
Yes and no, but remember, in the passage there, it says member states or through state resources. That does not include the European Union.
Yeah.
So the European Union is allowed to do this, but states themselves cannot. The following shall be compatible with the internal market. Aid having a social character, granted to individual consumers, provided that such aid is granted without discrimination related to the origin of products concerned. The next one is aid to make good the damage caused by natural disasters or exceptional occurrences. And then finally, aid granted to the economy of certain areas of the Federal Republic of Germany affected by the division of Germany, insofar as such aid is required in order to compensate for economic disadvantages caused by that division. And then there's just so you know, there's a couple other like possible exceptions. So those are absolute exceptions. Like if you fall into one of them, it applies. But there are other possibilities. Aid to promote economic development of areas where the standard of living is abnormally low, or where the serious underemployment in the regions, blah, 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 blah. The next one is aid to promote the execution of an important project of common European interest, or to remedy a serious disturbance in the economy of a member state. Aid to facilitate development of certain economic activities, aid to promote cultural and heritage conservation, and other categories by specific decision of the council.
Green energy has been considered to fall into one of these categories. I don't know what, but it is.
And like a lot of them are coming from the EU. Like a lot of the green energy stuff is literally just state distribution of European.
That's true. Yeah. The point is, so I think where you see that the telecom is a good example of where you see this having like a really good effect for consumers, this insistence on competition. However, you see its negative effects in a lot of other areas, like I would say rail travel, for example. Rail travel, which I've been wanting to do an episode on for a while, is a good example of something where this competitive logic is being pushed into an area where it makes so little sense, and just having bizarre consequences and for something that is effectively public service in a lot of cases. But yeah, it's interesting. I think that there's a lot more we could talk about at some point about the European Commission's competition rules. It's sort of like they've sort of taken this neoliberal like World Trade Organization logic, which essentially came from the US in its modern form, and implemented the most like extreme interpretation of it in the way that the US doesn't do.
I would argue it's the only honest interpretation of it.
Yeah, you're right. It's an honest interpretation. Yeah, sure, I agree with that. But it's sort of like shooting Europe in the foot in a lot of areas, because the US, as we've seen again recently, has always been willing to use state aid and protect its own industries where it is beneficial to the US. Like, and Europeans are now stomping their foots and going, but that's not what you said. And it's like, yeah, you fools. Didn't you always understand that the World Trade Organization was a tool for US interests? Like, it was never intended that these things would apply against US interests. And yet Europe has sort of, shot itself in the foot in a lot of ways by forcing itself and forcing its member state to play by rules that they didn't need to play by. like these rules are supposed to be implemented unjustly on poor countries. That's the whole idea. Europe didn't need to do it to itself. And I think they've really sort of in the long term massively hurt their economy when compared to the American economy, largely because of these things. But however, again, in some domains, it makes a ton of sense. It makes a ton of sense in telecom, at least when you're talking about private telecom markets and not a situation where telecoms are owned by the state. And it's also been great for air travel. If you think that cheap air travel is a desirable outcome, that has worked very well. Air travel is so much cheaper in Europe than the US, like incredibly so. There's also like way more routes. In the US is effectively like regional monopolies. There's effectively like cartel behavior in the US. And then in Europe, there isn't. And that's great on the one hand, not so great if you consider that probably ultra cheap airfare is not currently a good thing.
Don't worry, the EU will eventually have a framework to deal with this that will be just as like market heavy as the deregulation.
Well, they already do. And that's what they're doing to rail, right? That is their green solution to this. Is rail is now in so many cases so uncompetitive with flights. Like even in cases, let's say like Paris to Brussels, which has an incredible train connection in, I believe, like 80 minutes. You get there way faster than you would flying or driving. And yet there's still a lot of good reasons why people would fly or drive, which is that it's way cheaper. It's way cheaper to fly routes like that than take the train, which is ridiculous from an environmental perspective. It also doesn't make a lot of like sense in sort of a common sense way. Like, how could it possibly be cheaper to fly a damn plane.
Yep. Which has to fight friction, which is the
Right,
opposite of what
just
a
like
train deals with.
is inherently so much more energy intensive mode of transport than a train. Like it doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's complicated the reasons why it's got that way. But part of the reason is that the liberalization of airfare in Europe has made airfare extremely competitive and extremely cheap, and the EU's climate solution to that is let's do the same thing to trains. You know, they're basically saying, okay, the reason that trains are so much more expensive is because they're run by state monopolies and it's so inefficient. And they're just, if you look at everything the EU is doing with train regulations, it's basically saying, let's pretend this is a plane. And it's not a plane. I mean, there's many, many ways in which it's obviously not a plane. It has tracks. That's a big thing. And those tracks have to be owned by someone. And the EU has allowed those tracks to still be owned by member organizations, but the member states. But the problem is that tracks lose a ton of money. Back when rail was private, there was no company that was just building tracks and not running trains on those tracks. But that's effectively what like member states are forced to do now. Anyway, it's a whole mess. It's continually fascinating, just these dictates pushed out of Brussels, and it's not just like this pure destructive neoliberal logic, because it also has this like other side of it that is consumer protection. It's interesting. I think that brings us to another one of the big, because if you just hear about the rail travel and stuff, you're going to think, wow, this is just sort of a destructive, money grabbing privatization logic. But then when you look at things like some of the strong consumer protections, you see that it's more complicated. And one example of that is GDPR.
So before the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, member states have had their own frameworks for dealing with data protection. As you might imagine, these were insufficient for many reasons, one of which is that it's hard as a single state to impose your framework on someone like Google, and it's much easier to come up with a common framework. That was one aspect. Another aspect was most forms of data protection prior to GDPR in Europe were much more classical regulation, much more state regulated, where you would have to go to the government and ask for permission to do something, get an authorization for a certain like data treatment. So like imagine you were dealing with like certain sensitive data. You would have to go to a government body and say, hey, I want to do this. And the government body would authorize you to do so or not. And there would be, kind of a whole process before you actually dealt with the data. And that meant that a lot of the regulation was not effective, but it also meant that there wasn't so much general principles of data, right? We mostly focused on more sensitive forms of data treatment because frankly, the government just doesn't have time to make sure every single internet provider or internet operator, any platform is following all the rules. That brings us to GDPR itself. So the General Data Protection Regulation, which is important to note, is a regulation. So this is different from a directive, like an EU directive, because it has direct application in the European Union. So we actually use the text of the GDPR as the legal basis for the obligations that GDPR imposes. And now GDPR takes a much more private logic to data protection than more classical systems. What that means is it requires that companies put in place regulatory or compliance bodies within their organization, notably the data protection officer, who's in charge of ensuring that the regulation is put into place. A big part of this logic is very much along the lines of US-style regulation, where you kind of externalize the actual legwork to the private companies, and you come in to sanction violations only after, right? And relying on private operators to generally comply.
Hey everybody, Patrick in Post. I just wanted to make a quick clarification about who GDPR applies to. It applies to anybody who is dealing with personal data, regardless of the legal form this entity takes. Therefore, governments are also subject to GDPR and thus need to comply accordingly. Any public body that you find in France, for example, generally will have a DPO, a data protection officer. However, as in the private sector, it is common for people to essentially externalize these roles. Sometimes they'll do it to a third-party consulting firm, or sometimes they will give it to a lawyer, for example. In any case, the point here is that GDPR is a global regulation that attaches to the object, which is data. This is very different from things like HIPAA, which focus on who has the data. Now, importantly, GDPR only applies to personal data. But luckily, we are given a large definition for personal data as encompassing anything that can either directly or indirectly identify an individual, or by the accumulation of multiple variables can identify an individual. For example, law enforcement agencies or intelligence agencies use what is called pattern of life analysis to take many factors in order to figure out who someone is. So this could be some cell phone data, this could be some location data, that none of which specifically identifies a specific individual, but if you put together the pieces, can in fact identify, at the end of the day, a natural person. So GDPR, by having this large definition, goes so far as to protect data that people incorrectly claim is anonymized. Often, people will claim that data is anonymized simply because they have given each user, for example, a unique identifier, but that they don't tell anyone who that unique identifier belongs to. Now, of course, this is actually a form of pseudo-anonymization, and GDPR does not cease to apply just because you've done that. So if personal data is protected under GDPR, some personal data enjoys a greater protection than the standard GDPR baseline. Sometimes this is just the result of national legislation, which might go further than GDPR for different kinds of data. For example, in France, filming the public way requires a special authorization, right? You can't just put like a security camera in which the public street is visible, for example. But also under GDPR itself, certain types of data, thinking particularly about one's religious affiliations or one's sexuality, is considered, particularly sensitive data, and thus needs to be treated in a particularly cautious way. Now, one of the advantages of GDPR is the fact that it is indeed so general and thus has such a large scope. But this can also be a disadvantage because many of its principles are up to a certain degree of interpretation and eventual litigation in front of national and European courts. An example I'll give is this. Many online services will justify the collection of personal data as being necessary in order to complete a contract with their users. So, for example, they will say, well, if we don't know their first and last name, how are we going to sign a contract with them? And while there's some degree of truth to that, there's many technological means, like I think of zero trust proofs, or honestly just reduction of the amount of information that's collected on people as ways of still being able to perform a contract without resorting to the sort of mass data collection that we are all subject to. Okay, back to you, Patrick.
So we're relying on companies like Google to say, well, no, I really need your first, last name, middle initial, phone number, zip code, email address for your account. And Google will tell you in their privacy policy why they want that data, right? But nobody's there to tell Google, no. Why do you like to be honest, why does Google need your address? I don't know if there's a justified reason. They could even not have our names, like arguably, like there's a way they could provide all their services without collecting that data. And if they need to collect it, say for payment, they could do it in such a way that it's ephemeral, right? Like only their payment provider gets to know your name, but Google never knows it, right? So the complexity of this, or the good aspect of the system, is it hits everything, right? It's a very wide scope. The difficulty is that enforcing it is we're essentially trusting companies to enforce it themselves, and only can we do anything about their enforcement if they mess up in such a way that's so egregious that the government's going to step in. With that said, though, this framework is something only I think Americans could dream of. The California's government has kind of tried to do something similar. I'm not too familiar with their law over there, but just generally speaking, GDPR is probably the only, other than the Swiss law, which is basically based off GDPR, it's probably the only comprehensive data regulation. And so some of the practical consequences of GDPR on the internet that we all know and love here in Europe is that normally, for example, everything is supposed to be opt-in, right? Like data collection is always opt-in, and it needs to be explicit consent. So how many times, Liam, have you been to a website in the United States where, there's 14 different checkboxes that are all pre-checked for you that apparently sign up to give your DNA over when you sign this form and you give up your right
Well,
to life.
you don't even see it most of the time.
Exactly. So that kind of stuff, you from a practical standpoint, you notice on the European internet that
Well,
generally those boxes are not checked.
I would say the practical standpoint, realistically, that probably most people notice is that it's very annoying to visit websites in Europe because of the cookie pop-ups, where you're forced to. Anyone who's been to Europe has seen this. Any website you open will say, do you opt in for cookies or do you not visit the site? Which is one, doesn't really do anything. It's just annoying, and I guarantee you that is how the vast majority of Europeans are familiar with this law and nothing else.
So the GDPR regulation doesn't actually require cookie notices, but cookies obviously are one of the main tools that websites use to track you. So necessarily they're collecting personal data. They're trying to figure out your age, your name, where you live, what you like, etc., in order to sell you ads. And so on the basis of explicit and informed consent, they, in order to do those kinds of activities, would need to get your consent. But as we said, there's no authorization system here. So you don't have a government body, as I think you should, which you should have to submit your cookie banner to, and they should say whether or not you're faithfully complying with the regulation.
Yeah, because I think this is a great example. We know because you can see it on almost any website you visit, that like lots of them, sometimes you get no, I don't want cookies as an option. But a huge amount of the time you either get the no option is just like I'm not visiting this site, or it's or it's you pay. I've been seeing that more and more often, especially French, like some French news sites will say like you can either accept cookies or I'll pay €1. Tons of people are getting away with it. Like it's common on tons and tons of big websites. Or if there is a no option, you have to click into some settings and create an account and go down some rabbit hole.
So some security researchers at ETH Zurich did some research into the cookie banner and found that in a remarkable number of cases, almost 50% of cases, they found that the cookie banners were merely cosmetic, meaning the banner itself, like refusing cookies in the banner itself, did not stop tracking cookies from being used, or the cookies were used before the user opted out.
Yeah, I would say this is completely ineffective, 100% useless thing. And all it does is serve to annoy people. And I'm sure that some websites make their cookie board banners extra annoying so that you have this impression, and they're always like, oh, we're being forced to do this, right? And I think it does sort of give a lot of people the impression of, oh, goddamn European Union with their stupid red tape that doesn't do anything again. And they're kind of right in this aspect. However, the GDPR is doing a lot of other things behind the scenes.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah,
that's the thing. But this is the visible face. I mean, this is a sort of disaster in terms of the public knowledge of this law. Is the visible face of it is something that is just annoys everyone all the time. Like it really is quite annoying, actually.
Yeah. By the way, you can use AdBlock Origin and install or opt into the cookie banner annoyance list, and it will automatically refuse cookies on your behalf without you having to see it.
I didn't know that. That's nice, but it is generally really annoying, and it's the main thing that most people know about this law.
And it's a real shame.
And it doesn't do anything. It doesn't, like, that's the worst part. Is it doesn't even do the thing it says it's supposed to do. It's a real massive screw up.
So I say that GDPR's advantage is its scope and the fact that it outlines principles of handling data. But on the same token, some of its principles are so large that it actually interpreting them is just a question for courts, and we got to see what happens, and for authorities to actually enforce them. Because, for example, my sort of extremist view on GDPR is most things on the internet are illegal if authorities would move on them. I'll give you an example. Why do we not have a cookie banner on our website? Because we do not use tracking cookies. Why? Because 1, I don't want your data. 2, GDPR says we have to do the absolute minimum necessary. There's no world in which it's necessary to stalk people. Unless your business model is stalking people, but I think that's illegitimate in the first place.
Yeah.
I think, aggressive litigation on this point, could it be good for making GDPR more effective?
Do you have any insight why this hasn't happened? GDPR has been in force for 6 years now, and why hasn't anyone come after these? Like in civil suits, because I get why the regulatory thing hasn't happened, because sort of almost the whole idea of EU regulations is to have regulations without a large civil service behind them, which makes no sense, right? They don't have an inspection body. Normal national level regulations, like let's say OSHA in the United States, everyone knows that would do nothing or very little if there was an inspection body behind it. Everyone knows that just...
Well, there are, to be fair. So like the CNIL, which is the independent administrative body in France, which is responsible for France's own stricter, by the way, version of GDPR. Because basically, member states are allowed to make GDPR stricter. And France has a stricter regime than GDPR. So it's GDPR plus the French regime, which a lot of which is inherited from prior to GDPR, because France had, as I mentioned earlier, an authorization system for a lot of things in terms of data treatment.
But there's no EU level body. Like there should be a body that goes along with at the level the regulations are happening at. So again, if you think about how like health and safety regulations work or food safety regulations work, they're based on there being people who go and inspect these things. They're not based on lawsuits, right? They're not based on like...
Lawsuits are a way to enforce some of your rights under GDPR. But I mean, there are enforcement actions. I think there's a lot of reasons that GDPR lacks the teeth I want it to have. But one of the more sympathetic explanations is honestly that the problem is so big that the kind of things you and I are talking about are relatively small in the grand scheme of things. I mean, there have been massive fines levied against many big operators in Europe for just flagrant violation, like not even doing the cookie banner kind of thing. I just don't think that there's necessarily the necessary bureaucracy to see full enjoyment of the rights that GDPR promises us. One of the interesting, by the way, things about GDPR is I said it just covers all personal data, period, right? And it distinguishes personal data from, particularly sensitive personal data, which by the way, would just, in Europe, you're not supposed to be able to just put up, private operators cannot just put up facial recognition software like in their stores, like you can in the United States, for example, because that's biometric. But because it's this sort of global approach, it avoids some of the loopholes in the United States' regulation on data, like HIPAA.
HIPAA, yeah.
So HIPAA is the regulation in the United States, which says healthcare data needs to be protected in a certain way, and it's a very protective regime. But basically, the way it's worded is it says doctors and hospitals and healthcare providers need to implement HIPAA. So it's about who deals with the data, not what the data is. Whereas GDPR takes the approach of it's what the data is, doesn't matter who's doing it. Why is that distinction really important? Because you can track Google can track whether or not you have AIDS based on your Google searches. That's perfectly legal, not protected by HIPAA. But if you tell your doctor, or your doctor does a test and finds out, they can't share that. What that means in the US is there's tons of modalities to get around these regulations. Think of abortion. You get an abortion in the United States. The healthcare provider that provides it, not allowed to tell anyone about it, protected by HIPAA. Can Google, because you typed into Google Maps the abortion clinic, can they sell that to your state that has made abortion illegal? Yes.
So what do you think are some concrete effects that GDPR has had? Because we've talked about one very non-concrete effect, which is these cookie opt-ins. Yeah, what's like a more major effect it's had?
Well, for example, data brokers are practically, at least the way we know them in the United States, they're practically illegal, right? You can't there's not peoplesearch.com in Europe where you can just figure out where anyone lives with a simple click of the button. There's much less opt-in by default. So, for example, PayPal recently in the United States has, by just sending people a simple email, decided to sell all their customers' data, and you can only opt out if you read the email and click the link, go to your settings, etc. That they didn't roll that out in Europe because they knew that wouldn't fly. I know, for example, like Udemy recently, it has announced it's going to steal all of the content unless you opt out for training generative AI. So classes that were recorded by teachers who thought they would help students are getting their classes stolen unless they opt out in a 2-week period, or else it's too late. That's not happening in Europe. They didn't roll that out in Europe, but they did in the United States. And just on the data broker point, there's a whole market where if you have $1, maybe 10 if you really want to go to a good provider, you can figure out anything you want about someone, credit history, anything. It's mind blowing. Do companies collect data? They shouldn't, all the time. But can you have a business model of collecting data that you shouldn't in the open? No. I mean, you have to be much more clandestine. If you in the US, you can literally just type in you can buy from data brokers lists of who's gay. I mean, that's a thing that's sold on the market, and you don't see that kind of thing in Europe.
And what about the right to be forgotten?
So the right to be forgotten is an interesting one because it took a while. Basically, it was only under GDPR that it was recognized. For a long time, it was not something that was accepted as sort of a fundamental right in Europe. But yeah, the right to be forgotten basically just means that you can have your personal information or your content removed from a provider. So it comes from this lawsuit where someone wanted their name removed from Google search results. They were like, I don't like that. Then when you type in my name, you find me on Google.
I have the opposite complaint, by the way.
The European courts said, look, obviously the president of the republic can't ask for this. A movie star can't ask for this, but anybody else, sure, you have a right to be forgotten. So that's definitely, important. I mean, think of just the amount of data that Facebook has accumulated on you, right? And you can ask providers to remove your data, and in theory, they're supposed to. And key thing is there's a notion of data retention, right? They should not be keeping data longer than it's necessary. So in theory, except for regulated industries like banking or whatever, they're supposed to generally delete your data within 2 years. So if you buy something at a store, they're not supposed to keep you in some database forever, in theory. Again, application is, I think, long from reality.
And can they get away with this by keeping your data outside of Europe? Like, can the American companies keep European data on, U.S. servers and not worry about this?
No. So European courts have actually said that U.S. Because basically there was an attempt to do twice, I believe, safe harbor negotiations between the United States and Europe, where basically the U.S. was like, look, we'll promise to protect your data more or less as long as you just sign here. And the commission agreed to it. They were like, okay, we think you've put in, enough protection.
Yeah, which shows you the type of guy they got working at the commission who thinks that. Too many honest Northern Europeans working there said, well, they told us that.
This is after Macron and Merkel had been spied on by the U.S. government.
Well, I bet they promised not to do that again, though.
Oh, okay. But the European court struck it down, actually, which was a bold move on their part, and they said no. This is the U.S. does not provide the guarantees for safe data processing, so no. So can they expatriate data to the United States anyway? Yeah, they do it all the time. Is my understanding of the reality, but are they supposed to? Absolutely not. And GDPR is weird because it has extraterritorial implications. In theory, if a European goes to the United States, the law is supposed to protect them while they're in the United States because they're, because it applies to European residents.
But really,
it doesn't.
It does. Talking about this really makes me wish that we had a less cravenly European Commission, because these things like this, it's so great in theory, and there's great parts about it, and it's like on the verge of just. I mean, it's just a no-brainer that European citizens, and obviously also citizens of the U.S. and everywhere else, should have these kind of protections. And it's just incredibly frustrating that the European Commission is, cravenly and really always seems to do the minimum on these things and never stands up to the U.S. properly. They often talk a big game, I feel like, but
all the time.
They really like saying bad things about American tech companies, especially, and sending Mark Zuckerberg into a fit or whatever. But then they back down because someone at the State Department or whatever called them, and we're not sending our best to the European Commission.
So there's other things that applies to sort of European technology law, like the DMA. So this is the Digital Markets Act, which it's kind of funny that they call it the Digital Markets Act because it's a directive. So clearly trying to get some kind of a American sounding vibe.
Yeah,
there,
sounds very American. Act.
But that might make sense because it's basically targeted at American companies. It's basically targeted at Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, and basically imposes on them certain obligations, mostly from a competition logic. So basically it says, okay, if you're a gatekeeper, which means you have power over what people see on the internet. So Google obviously is a gatekeeper. If Google removed Royal Palace Pod from the search results, we would basically not exist. If you typed into Google, U.S. Passport Office and a private company showed up instead of
the U.S. Passport Office, which I'm sure actually is what happens. Thank you, Google. They are essentially preventing people from getting that information, even though it's obviously the information that should come up.
Yeah, like I've got some data the EU, the European Commission, provide here in terms of market share of these major mostly American companies. And again, this is not surprising or any different than it is in the US, but just to hammer home, they said that Google search has a 95% market share. Meta-owned social media platforms, Facebook and Instagram, have a 90% share. Microsoft Windows has a 78% market share. Chrome has a 60% market share, right? These are crazy and obviously wouldn't be tolerated in other domains.
And by the way, the US tried to take a swing at Microsoft in the early 2000s, but they didn't do it like the Commission. The Commission went further. So, for example, when you get like a Windows installation in Europe, you're asked which browser you want to use. So not Edge by default, like is the case in the US. If in theory, phones are supposed to, I believe, do the same thing. They're trying to get people out of these sort of by default platform lock-ins. And I don't know. It's been a ride. I think a lot of it hasn't gone anywhere. I mean, like, you have to remember Amazon, Microsoft, and Google are cloud providers, and 90% of stuff is on their cloud. So I don't know. Like, is it really going to split up these things? No. But one of the things it does do that I think is good, the DMA, is search results, right? Like the idea that you would pay to get higher in the search results outside of the sponsored category, right? Like the sponsored category is one thing, right? But like a lot of these platforms had the idea, and I think do in the US, charge people to get higher in the result without disclosing that. So, it's supposed to prevent those kind of things. And, I guess it's all right. Has it gone fully into force? Have we seen full enforcement? Do we have good court cases yet? Not quite. But I mean, it's better than nothing. I think that's the general attitude here I have on this.
However, as a thought experiment, so let's think about these companies that they're talking about as gatekeepers here. They identified, how many was it? 22. And they identified 6 companies that they deemed gatekeepers: Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, ByteDance, Meta, and Microsoft. How many of those companies are European?
None.
0. Right? They're all American except for ByteDance, which is Chinese, the owner of TikTok. And of these other things that they identified, the only major one that's European is Spotify, which is Swedish. And imagine what the US government would do if it was in a similar situation, where every single part of the internet was dominated by European or Chinese or whatever. And the EU is a major market that hasn't developed its own competitors if you compare it to both China and Russia.
And probably can't, by the way.
Well, I don't know.
Without massive intervention, which I'm not saying I'm for or against. I'm just saying it would require an intervention that the Commission up till now and member states, except for maybe France, are not really willing to go ahead with.
Yeah.
I mean, for one, you're already on a very uncompetitive playing field when it's just so much cheaper to run a data center in low-cost electricity America than it is in Europe.
Yeah. And these privacy regulations don't help with that. And some people have said that, which isn't really a good argument against them, but it is true that it probably does make a lot of this, the business models of these companies less competitive in Europe, and would make it harder for a European company to try to do the same thing.
This is the interesting thing, because you mentioned China as an example. China forced its local internet to be Chinese, even if it's more expensive, even if they have the fact that they were behind in the sector, and they just said, we're going to go with it anyway, right?
And it worked.
And Europe has this problem where they haven't really done anything to stop big US tech company domination, because if they just got rid of or made it much harder for these companies to realistically operate in Europe, it wouldn't matter that data centers cost more in Europe.
I exactly. And I think Russia is an even better example, because obviously China's huge. Russia pretty much has all of its own social media platforms, search engine, YouTube knockoff, etc. And they did even before like the tech companies started censoring them after the started.
Well, it's sort of like when Google left China. It was like too late for them anyway. They made a whole thing about how it was a freedom of speech thing. No, it was literally just they found one of the many examples of China censoring them, because that was common practice, and just said, oh, that's why we're leaving. But no, it's because they were losing dramatically the battle.
So
right?
And Google and all these companies had the same problem in Russia even before, they were effectively banned there. And I'm not sure exactly why that is. I think part of it is just that they didn't localize very well to those massive markets, which is a big L on their part. But my point is, I'm not at all advocating that. And I think that sounds abhorrent to people to be like, Europe should be like China or Russia on the internet. I'm not advocating that kind of thing, but I think you can see that like China and Russia have developed perfectly good alternatives. Like I don't think anyone cares, you know what I mean? Maybe they care in Russia, maybe they care that they can't access like specifically American things, but they don't care that they have to use these quote unquote inferior platforms. No, it's the same. It's not really that difficult to develop these platforms from like a technical level. So yeah, I agree with you. I think the goal should be to force out American companies, not by banning them in the way that China did, but just by implement regulations that are no brainers, really no brainers in terms of like what is good for consumers. Actually enforce GDPR, make their parasitic business models unprofitable, and boom, that's your solution to getting your European tech giants that Macron and everyone, like all these European leaders who have been moaning for ages that there's no big European tech companies. This has been Macron's big thing, and it hasn't really worked. And it's because they're not willing to take on the Americans who are competing on an unfair playing field because they're abusing the rights of European citizens.
Yeah, well, and imagine maybe European companies, if like they enjoyed some protectionism in the sense of having to build ethical enough business models, maybe they will become dominant elsewhere because maybe they'll have the only search engine that actually has useful results.
I believe that on this continent of 500 million people, we have someone with the ability to build a search engine that works, which appears to have slipped out of Google's hands.
Right. And like, I'm not into this whole AI thing, but I don't know, maybe we'll be able to make an AI that doesn't like suggest huffing paint as like a solution to a problem. You know what I mean?
I think that's probably an inherent feature of AI.
All right. Maybe we can just have programmatic things that actually do the thing they're supposed to do instead of stealing all your data.
No, but let's talk about AI. So there's been some recent AI legislation in the commission, right?
Yeah, so the commission has moved forward on its AI directive, which I'm sort of unfamiliar with the technical aspects of it, but I know one of the things that it does is it requires that these models actually be auditable, meaning that we can actually audit the content in these models. I'm a little bit skeptical on these kinds of things, though, because I think it's probably too late. Without, a more strict, like has ChatGPT stopped operating in Europe because they're not going to be able to actually show regulators where their stuff comes from? I don't know. And it's a huge issue because like, I forget which model it was, but do you know about this open source model? One of the big open source models. So the thing is open source language models are not actually always open source. So Meta has open source language models, but they don't actually make the data sets they use open source. In one of them, they found a hell of a lot of child pornography, or CSAM, I guess, as the Americans call it now. And the only reason that was ever discovered was because the data set was actually available for people to verify. And it's undoubtedly the case with all language models that they have this content in it, and they're I have a hard time imagining OpenAI being willing to opening those data sets for European regulators. So I don't know. We'll see where Europe goes on this, but I will say it is the only place outside, maybe China has something. I don't know. It's the only place, Europe, that I am aware of that has actually moved forward meaningfully on AI regulation, because that's definitely not the case in the US. I mean, the bill from California was pretty much shut down immediately by the governor, right? It was the governor who intervened to stop it. Because he loves Google so much or whatever.
All the European tech people really hate this kind of stuff because they say that Europe is sort of regulating itself out of being able to compete with the US on AI. And it is true, actually, that like a lot of the top people at these AI companies are European.
Well, yeah, because Europe is the only place that actually has the competence to, the educational competence to do this stuff.
Right. And it is definitely true that there is sort of a brain drain for this kind of stuff towards the US, and not just from Europe, but also from Russia and from India and so on. And that is true. However, obviously, or I guess it's not so obvious to these tech people, but the vision they want for Europe, which is just competing in a race to the bottom with the US, saying, yes, please, I will offer you all my citizens as sacrificial pigs to be used in your model or whatever, is one that I see no reason why we should compete in. And I certainly don't want, as a European resident, my data to be used that way. And I think that's much more important for most people than the AI economy of Paris. Or that, that Paris actually now has the fourth most valuable AI startup.
Yeah, that makes...
Have you heard of this?
Mistral?
Mistral. Yeah. Which they're very excited about that. I bet Macron calls them like every day. He's just constantly in there going, guys, how's it going in here? All good with the AI?
All this to say is I think that Europe has made progress, but if they are not willing to take the step to build a true European internet, then while all of this stuff will be beneficial in the short term for people like me who would rather my data not be sold a l'American, I don't think it'll ultimately mean much, because if ultimately at the end of the day all the American companies are controlling all of these resources anyway, we just really have no guarantees that they're respecting the quote-unquote European values. So I think we both hope that there's a world in which Europe takes more seriously its internet than it already has,
Yeah, and it's still, again, taking it more seriously than anyone else, really, except China, if you consider that.
What's always interesting about these questions in Europe that, will tell you how frustrating they can be, these very bureaucratic processes. They're actually talking about the issue itself, right? I feel like if you have this debate in the US, it's either on one side you have like a guy screaming at you about how freedom of speech involves stealing everyone's personal data or whatever, and another person on the other side being like, what if we did it like Europe, and then someone throws like a burger at them or whatever.
As with many things, this is one of the major things I like about living in Europe, and it seems like an abstract thing, I guess, that doesn't impact my actual day-to-day life very much, but I like this feeling that there are societal discussions here about these issues, and the sense that governments could do something about them. Not that they really are in most cases, but there are mechanisms whereby they could, and it's possible to picture. There are political parties that get seats in parliaments that want to change these things, and it's possible to picture how something could change in Europe, not just about internet privacy, but about really everything. Whereas in the US, it's almost impossible to see. Even in my wildest dreams, I'm like, how would this come to pass that we had any sort of thing like this in the US?
No. They're going to sell my DNA and actually put a chip in us before they're willing to let us opt out to anything veritably. All right. Well, thank you for listening to the Royal Palace Podcast.
Thanks, everyone.
If you liked this episode, share it with your friends, if you don't mind. We're trying to get listeners. That's our goal.
That would be good, yeah.
La France est une chose, à mes yeux, très considérable. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Je veux dire par là qu'à mon sens, elle est quelque chose de très grand. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il y a même là quelque chose d'extraordinaire. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il faut que la France joue son rôle, c'est exact. Et pour qu'elle joue son rôle, il faut qu'elle soit la France.